come a long way. So there was a lot of stuff that we've already covered. A lot of that, a lot of it, of course, in the early chapters was really just dealing with all of the events leading up to the tribulation. Events like obviously the three kingdoms that had gone in terms of Daniel's vision. There was uh, the Babylonian kingdom, the Persian kingdom, the Greek kingdom, and then of course the fourth empire being the Roman kingdom, which leads us to the tribulation period. So we're still in the fourth kingdom period. Now we're heading into the tribulation. The Antichrist is now beginning to warm up with things here. And tonight also we'll be going back to Daniel 9, because that really, although we did cover Daniel in the first part, and that was really to do with the first three empires, and also it describes also the Roman Empire, in which we're in this stage now. But we'll also be looking at the beginning of tribulation, which is found in Daniel 9:24 to 27. So if you have your Bibles with you, we will refer to the passage of Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27. So the beginning of tribulation is what kicks off this chapter of chapter 9 of Footsteps of Messiah. And just to, if you haven't figured it out yet, and it's funny because this is one of the questions. On Friday night last week was our first youth gathering. Well, second one, but first in terms of a lesson. And we've decided to start with the end times. And I'll tell you what, out of all of the times we've done studies with young people, man, it was a full-on hour and a half where there was just questions coming left and right in regards to what they wanted to know about the end times. And so it's encouraging that the young people are very interested in this topic of the end times. So they had questions all over the place. And one of them was the rapture, that one of them assumed that the rapture was what kicked off the tribulation. So to hit that point home, the rapture is not what begins the tribulation. And that's quite a popular belief that's held out there. The rapture may happen, but the tribulation itself may not happen till sometime later. The key thing to remember is that what does kick off the tribulation, or the beginning of it, is the signing of the treaty between the Antichrist and Israel, is what will begin the tribulation. So that is what would be the sign, or the event that will kick off the tribulation, is when the Antichrist himself will sign a treaty, or 7-year peace treaty or covenant between himself and Israel, is what will begin the tribulation. Now, there's two key passages that we'll only go through the first key passage, but there's two key passages that in regards to the signing of the treaty or the covenant between the Antichrist and Israel, is in Daniel 9 verses 24 to 27. So that's one of the first key passages we will go through. So let's just read, but just before 24, 27, when you look at the verses in Daniel 9, from the verses 1 right up to verses 23, before the three verses that we were going to cover, those verses from 1 to 23 gives the intro to what we're going to find out later on tonight, is the 77s prophecies. And those are the prophecies we will find in verses 24, 27. But from verses 1 to 23 of Daniel 9, that will give us the introduction to what will be covering in verses 24, 27. So basically, in the first two verses of Daniel 9, I'll quickly read that out. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah the prophet, for the accomplishing of the desolations of Jerusalem, even 70 years. 70 years. So the background of verses 1 and 2 is that what we find here is that Daniel had been studying the book of Jeremiah, and he's been studying other prophets, example the likes of Isaiah, as well as that those are some of the prophets he would have been studying. And from studying these books, what we see is Daniel finds out that the Babylonian captivity would be 70 years. So remember, Babylon's taken Israel into captivity. Of course, that's where Daniel has. And Daniel knows that from studying those books, that captivity would only last 70 years. What we find here is that the 70 years is nearly up. And I can just imagine Daniel probably counting that time down. So that's what Daniel would have understood up to this point. So that's his understanding that, of course, that the 70 years will be nearly up. But there is something that Daniel does misunderstand in regards to those prophecies of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and the other prophets. And the misunderstanding is that he was thinking that the millennium kingdom would follow straight after the 70 years of captivity. So that's where Daniel's misunderstanding is that one, he knows that the 70 years is nearly up in terms of the captivity of Israel under the Babylonians, but he's misunderstanding in that he assumes that the millennium kingdom would come in straight after the 70 years of them being in captivity. And so that's the misunderstanding that Daniel has. Now you'll see also that I guess from the prophets, one of the other reasons probably why he misunderstood is that he also understood, this is Daniel, that one of the preconditions for the millennium kingdom to be set up. Now the millennium kingdom, I'll explain what that is if you're not familiar with it already. The millennium kingdom simply refers to the 1,000 years that Jesus will reign on earth, and that's what the kingdom that Daniel's understanding. But one of the preconditions that Daniel also understood from the prophets was that the kingdom would be Israel's confession of their sins. So before the kingdom is set up, Israel needs to confess her sins, the nation's sins, to God. Now it's on that assumption that what we find that from verses 3 to 19, we see, if you we're not going to read all of that, but what you'll see that from verses 3 to 19, what you actually see is, based on that assumption that we talked about earlier, is that Daniel is now praying a prayer of confession for Israel's sins. And this is verses 3 to 19. So that's what you're seeing there. And that's based on because Daniel is assumed or misunderstood that the millennium kingdom will come straight after the 70 years of captivity under Babylon. And so then we arrive to verses 20 to 23. And while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Jehovah my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he instructed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee wisdom and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment went forth, And I am come to tell thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. Here we have the angel Gabriel, sent by God, obviously, and he's sent there for the purpose of correcting Daniel's misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is about his view of the kingdom being set up after the 70 years of captivity. And what Gabriel reveals to Daniel is God's program. And he's revealing God's program because it's God's program which would bring in the kingdom, informing Daniel that it isn't 70 years, but 77s of years before the kingdom would be established. Imagine that, waiting for 70 years and then you get told it's not 70 years, it's 77s of years. So it obviously means that it's not the time frame that Daniel is waiting for. And so what we'll be covering tonight is, of course, this term or the decree of what Daniel explains, or what it's mentioning in the book of Daniel, is the 77s of Daniel 9, verse 24. Now, it says in that passage in verse 24, it says, 70 weeks are decreed upon your people and upon your holy city. Now, just going to make a note here that Dr. Arnold Fruchtenberg makes a very special note here in regards to this chapter. He's saying here that that one of the greatest mistakes in biblical interpretation is that the word has been translated here as weeks. And what he's saying is that actually that's the wrong interpretation of that word, because it's given here as weeks. But he's saying that that would require the word Shavuot, which is S-H-A-V-U-O-T, S-H-A-V-U-O-T, for those of you who want to take that note down. But the actual word used in Hebrew is Shavuyim, and that means 7. So that second word is S-H-V-U-I-M, and that means 7s, and that's the word that should have been used. But that's the actual word that's used, but it's mistranslated as weeks. Instead, it should be translated 7s. So just note that, I guess, in your Bibles. In the translation, it's interpreted as 70 weeks, but the actual translation should have been translated to 77s. Okay, so just make a note of that. Now, you're wondering, okay, what's 77s? Well, it's used in the same way. I guess if you're in the English, we're familiar with that term, the word dozen. And we know that the word dozen means the number 12, So, in the same way, that the word dozen can be applied to anything, So it's not specific to one thing. So you can say a dozen people, a dozen eggs, for example, or a dozen others. And it's the same thing here with the 7s. And that also has the same application. And so the word 7s, or the term 7s, can also be referred to in the same way, in the sense of like 7 of anything. So like how you say a dozen, the Hebrew word or for it in the way that's used for 7, it's used in the same way, 7s of anything. And here, what we see here in the passage of verse 24 in Daniel 9, we see it's used as in a 7 of years. Okay, so that's how it's used here. And of course we know that because Daniel, of course, is he's been dealing with terms of years, remember? So he's using those terms of years because he's been counting it down. the years of the 70 years that he already understands from prophecy in regards to the captivity that he's been under. So he's been there for a while now. So you see that Daniel is late in his years and he's anxiously waiting for that. Remember, he went into captivity while young, probably between the ages of 14 or 15 when he was carried away. And the Babylonians came and destroyed the first temple. And so what we see is that because of that, we can see why Daniel naturally assumes that the millennium kingdom will be set up after the 70 years. But here we see that Gabriel tells Daniel it will be 77s of years, and what that total comes to is a total of 490 years. So it's a 490 year period, not just a 70-year period that I guess poor Daniel would have been expecting. So he's now being told that it's not 70 years by Gabriel, it's actually a 490 year period that has been decreed by God in order for this millennium kingdom to begin. So the Hebrew word for decreed means to cut off or to determine. And that's what the Hebrew word decreed means. Now, the theme throughout the book of Daniel, the theme has been the times of Gentiles. Remember, we covered this, what the times of Gentiles. The times of Gentiles is a period when Gentile is, rules over Jerusalem, or Gentile control over Jerusalem. And we know this because the time of Daniel's vision, when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire took over, we know that's when the times of Gentiles started, is when Babylon took over Jerusalem and held Israel captive. So the times of Gentiles, just to be reminded again, is the lengthy period that began with Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And that time frame, so that's when it started, but we know that it ends at the close of tribulation and also when the second coming of Messiah comes. So that's when the times of Gentiles comes to an end. Started with Nebuchadnezzar at 586 BC, and it finishes at the end of tribulation with the second coming of the Messiah. And so what we see is that the 490 year period that God has decreed on the Jewish peoples. You see my spelling there, it's gone a bit wonky, eh? I've doubled it. That's what happens when you have two big fingers. And so there's six things, or six purposes that this 490 year period that God decrees on the Jewish people. Note specifically the Jewish people. And we're going to go through that six of those purposes tonight and what those purposes will accomplish and why God has decreed this 490 year period, or slash 77 years. Now, so Daniel, we see, is told that a period of 490 years is decreed, and what that also specifically means is that it's a period that's going to be cut out of the times of Gentiles. So you know how we mentioned the times of Gentiles. What we're going to see is that this 490 year period will be cut out of that, from that times of the Gentiles, in order to bring about the final restoration of Israel. And that's the purpose of what this decree is, specifically in regards to the Jewish people, but also in regards to God's plan to come about the final restoration of where Israel is concerned. So when we're dealing with that leads to the next thing is that when we're dealing with the 77s, what needs to be noted is that the center of this particular program has nothing to do with the church. Okay, so that's one point that we need to, I guess, be clear on, is that when it comes to the what we understand as the 77s of Daniel, that program is specific only to the Jewish people and not to the church. This particular program is not for the church, only concerns Israel. So the center of the 77s program is specifically the Jewish people, and not only the Jewish people, but also in regards to the Jewish city of Jerusalem. So if you're following the news, you will see that there's so much happening around there was a whole lot of outrage when they decided to move the embassies to Jerusalem. You could see all of the outrage there. So in regards to biblical prophecies, you will see a lot of the power moves done around where Israel is concerned currently, but also will start to heat up also in a future period of time when the Antichrist will get about arranging a 7-year covenant with Israel. So the purpose of the 77s, and when we look at Daniel 9:24, we're going to go through 6 of those things tonight. And when we look at that verse of verse 24, we see that 70 weeks are decreed upon your people and upon your holy city to finish transgression. This is verse 24 that I'm reading. And to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And so it's out of that verse that we see 6 of those things of what this 490-year period and what God's purpose will be in those things. So the first thing up there, right there on our screen, one of the first purposes is to finish transgression. Now, to finish in Hebrew means restrain firmly, restrain completely, or to bring to completion. Now, remember, what's the context we're talking about here? The context is in relation to specifically to who? Its relation is specifically to how God is now going to deal with Israel. So anyone that tries to interpret that this verse refers to anything outside of the Jewish people, or trying to make parallels with this with us Gentiles or any other type of thing, the exegesis, as we've seen here, it's only referring to Israel in its context, or to what God is using this as a purpose to accomplish 6 things in regards to Israel. So transgression is a very strong word for sin. So that word transgression is a strong word for sin, which literally means to rebel. And so the purpose there is, it's not for, in terms of God, from God's point of view, it's not merely to finish the transgression, but to finish the transgression, or to finish the rebellion. And so when we're talking about rebellion, what's the rebellion that it's specifically referring to here? And now that we know the context is talking about Israel, it's really specific to a specific act of rebellion, and the context is the rejection of Israel, or by Israel, of the messiahship of Jesus in the New Testament, especially in Matthew 12. Remember when Jesus, his final miracle to prove, authenticate who he was. Remember when he cast out the deaf and dumb demon, and that was one of the messianic miracles that was to prove his messiahship. The people looked towards the leadership of Israel, which were the Pharisees, or the religious leaders at that time, but yet they rejected the Messiah, and not only did they not attribute that particular miracle, they accused them of being that the miracle was done by Prince Beelzebub. So basically, the accusation there is the accusation that Jesus was demon possessed. It's probably the worst thing you can do, is call the Messiah that. And that's the rejection that it's specifically talking about here, is the rejection by Israel in regards to the Messiah. Now the second purpose there that we see there also on the screen, it also says to make an end of sins. Now the Hebrew word translated from to make an end means to seal up or to shut up in prison house, is what that that's what it means. And also means to be securely kept, or to be locked up, or to be prevented from roaming at random. Now we know that sins in Hebrew means to miss the mark, and so what this specifically refers to sins in daily life. Now we know the context is referring to sins in daily life by the Jewish people. Now what this also leads to is that understanding that, of course, the millennium kingdom, what it's saying here, that during the millennium kingdom, or the 1,000 years of when Jesus is ruling on earth with all of the of course us believers as well, but specifically he'll be ruling from Israel, which will become really the capital of the world in the new millennium. There will be sins, even though there won't be any Satan around, or there won't be any poverty, there won't be any sickness as well. It will literally be almost near perfect conditions, but there will still be sin. Now the sins will only apply to the Gentile nations. Of course, they won't apply to us being believers, but it will be the new population that will grow during that millennium period from the beginning, which will be the Gentile nations. They will have sins, but in terms of Israel, there will be no sin in Israel. So this is taught in Isaiah 27 verse 9. So I'll give you these passages and you can read these in your own time. Isaiah 27 verse 9, Ezekiel 36 verses 25 to 27, and also Ezekiel 36 verses 37 to 23. And in those passages, also in Jeremiah ones, Jeremiah predicts that there will be a day that will come in the future, of course, when all Israel's sins will be removed and all Israel will be saved. And so regardless of whether it's from the least to the greatest, regardless whether it's from the least to the greatest, what it's saying that all of Israel at that period during the millennium, none of them will have sin. In other words, they will know the Messiah, and they will always have a knowledge of the Messiah during that period. Whereas the Gentile population at that time, they have to, they will still have sin amongst them, and they still have choice whether they should believe in the Messiah. That will be an interesting time, eh? I mean, after the tribulation, you think that, well, mind you, that's the new population that won't know of the tribulation, but to have the Messiah there as well, and then to still not believe in him. Apparently, they're given 100 years to live. They have a chance to either accept the Lord at that time and then become eternal like us, or believers, but they still have a choice, and they have 100 years up to do that. But anyway, I won't cover that too much because that's something that we still have to cover in the new chapters. Something to look forward to in detail in regards to the Millennium Kingdom. So, in relation to Israel, this second purpose that we're talking about here of the 77s, and that purpose is to bring an end to sins in terms of general daily living in regards to the nation of Israel. And also that, what you see here is that on one hand, God deals with one specific sin, and that specific sin that we mentioned earlier is the rejection of Messiah. And then on the other hand, what we see here is that God is also dealing with the daily sinning in Israel, which will also stop during the Millennium Kingdom. The third purpose of the 77s, or the program of the 77s, now that we know what that program is from God's point of view, is that that during the tribulation, the point of it is to make reconciliation for iniquity. For iniquity. Now, reconciliation in Hebrew means to make an atonement. That's what it means in Hebrew, to make an atonement. Now, the means by which the first and second purposes will be accomplished will be done through this reconciliation here, which is through an atonement. And the reason why, now that we know the context in regards to where Israel is concerned, the reason why they need to make an atonement is because of that word iniquity refers to the sin nature. So here we look at iniquity. Iniquity means sin nature. So what we see here is that three things will be removed by the 77s program in regards to Israel. And it's referring to, so what we see here is the aspect of the 77s program is really in regards to the cleansing of Israel. The cleansing of Israel. And the three things are, the first thing that is the dealing with the national rejection of the Messiah, which this program, the 77 programs will deal with. And then the second aspect of it is the sinning daily nature of Israel. And then the third thing is it will also deal with the sin nature of Israel. And so when the sin nature is dealt with, then of course the result will be that Israel will be saved. Of course, during the millennium there won't be an issue. So this is something unique just for in regards to the Jewish people or the Israel nation at that time. The fourth thing that you will see there is the fourth purpose is that this program is to bring in an age of righteousness. An age of righteousness. Now, this age of righteousness is obviously referring to the Millennium Kingdom or the Messianic Kingdom, or it basically refers to the 1,000-year period after the tribulation, when after the second coming, Jesus sets up his kingdom, and we get to live with him for 1,000 years in a, what do you call it, recycled earth, recycled planet. And passages like Isaiah 1 verse 26, I'll get you to note that, and you can read that in your own time. Isaiah 1 verse 26, Isaiah 11 verses 2 to 5, and also Jeremiah 23 verses 5 to 6, and then of course Jeremiah 33 verses 15 to 18. Now the fifth thing, or the fifth purpose, is that we come across is that it's the fifth purpose is to cause a cessation of prophecy. In other words, cessation is simply that there won't be any more prophecies, or all prophecies will be fulfilled. But then also leads to so that also covers cessation, or the ceasing of both the oral and written prophecies, because the program of the 77s in regards to Israel will contain the final fulfillment of all the prophecies. So the function of all prophecies will cease at the coming of the Messiah. So that's what it means here. But then there's another question that is raised, and that question is well, how can the Messianic kingdom fulfill all prophecies, since there are more things that happens beyond the kingdom, eh? So we know that there is an eternal order after the millennial kingdom. How can this prophecy say that all prophecy will cease, when we know there's another eternal order that happens beyond the kingdom? Well, there's one thing that we need to note, is that remember that in regards to the Old Testament, what we see is that none of the Old Testament prophets ever saw, or not only saw, but they weren't really giving any revelations beyond the kingdom or the millennium. So that's the reason why. Because as regards to the Old Testament prophets, they were only given revelation in regards to the millennium kingdom and nothing further than that. So, but what we see is that the eternal order, the eternal state, prophecies in regards to that are all New Testament prophecies, not Old Testament ones. So the Old Testament prophets would not know about anything beyond the millennium kingdom, whereas in the New Testament, of course, we know that in the last passages of Revelation, there are completely new revelations in the book of Revelation. I think in the last probably 2 chapters, I think it is, there are completely new revelations that none of the Old Testament prophets were aware of. So that's the reason why, and that's the answer to that question. Next we come to the 6th purpose, and this is one that we'll finish on tonight with, is it's to anoint the most holy place. It's to anoint the most holy place. Now, from the Hebrew, it should actually read to anoint a most holy place. It's not a most holy person, but it's referring to a most holy place that is to be anointed, because normally you would refer to a person to be anointed, but not an actual place. So the most holy place then is the temple. And so what we've got to be clear on here, and I've put in, you'll be familiar with this diagram because I put it in probably 2 or 3 chapters back. But when we're talking about the temple, it's not referring to the first temple. And I've just put in there, of course, is the first temple being the Solomon's temple. I know it's not that one that it's referring to here in this passage, or here in this particular purpose. And we know it's not the second temple, because that temple is the temple by Zerubbabel, or Herod's temple, which came about in the New Testament. And then we know it's not the tribulation temple, which would have been erected by this time during the tribulation. We know that's not the one, definitely. So then it must refer to that 4th temple, which is the temple. There will be a temple in the Millennium Kingdom, and that's the temple that it refers to in the 6th purpose of the 77's program in regards to Israel, is that there will be a Millennium Temple that will be erected during the 1,000 years. And so that's the one that's referred to here as to be the most holy place, and that's the most holy place, which is that temple, the Millennium Temple. And so that's the temple. So this 4th temple, which is in the Messianic kingdom, is a temple that, you see that all the other 3 temples are all built by man. The 4th temple, or the 4th Millennium Temple, is a temple, of course, that the Lord himself built. And so not only did he build it himself, but this will also be anointed by the Lord himself as part of the program of the 77s. Okay, so that concludes in terms of this part of the study that I want to go through tonight, because I want us just to digest that. And also when we go through to the next part of chapter 9, we're going to go through a little bit more detail on what that 490 breaks up in. But if anything, in terms of this beginning of the tribulation, one of the things that is important is for us to really understand the role where Israel is concerned, because remember, us as the church are not here during the tribulation period, So that's one thing to notice, that we as the church will not be here during this period of the tribulation. And that's why, in terms of the studying in detail about especially the role of Israel in the 77's program, is important to understand, because while we're up in heaven, uh, our the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, will have to go through tribulation, and that's part of what that program will be. And it's also good to understand that, because as we go through the rest of the tribulation, a lot of it in context is referring to the things to bring Israel to its knees so then they can accept the Messiah that they have rejected. A lot of the Jews today, especially the Orthodox they're wanting to build that temple, which obviously when we look at the timeline that we're looking there, they will build that tribulation temple. But also remember, they don't acknowledge the Messiah. They're still waiting for the first coming. And so that's where the nation of Israel at the moment is. And also now there's a mass exodus of them going back to Israel, which is interesting in these times, because that's just part of the regathering that we talked about in regards to our Jewish brothers. But another thing too that I'm just reminded of too is that's why scriptures encourage us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That we are to continue to pray for our Jewish brothers and sisters, especially for their salvation. It's one of the reasons why that we were grafted into part of the blessings of the Abrahamic, and also because of the Messiah, is to provoke the Jewish people to a jealousy so that they recognize the Messiah. So our goal is not only to spread the gospel to a lot of our Gentile unbelieving family members and friends and even enemies, but also our duty is also to give the gospel to the Jews first. That's one of the teaching points of Romans 10 and 11 also, that encourage us as believers because of the blessings we did receive because of the a lot of the work that our Jewish brothers have done. That in some ways we owe a lot to them in regards to the faith. So we should always look at opportunities to either support Jewish ministries that reach a lot of the Jewish people, and also just be able to give and present the gospel to them as much as we can where the opportunity is.